Kirby's Dream Land. In 1992, Masahiro Sakurai of HAL Laboratory, a company that wasn't actually Nintendo, and still isn't, technically, it's complicated, but under the programming of a twin Famicom, a Nintendo licensed console produced by the Sharp Corporation, strange enough, combined both Famicom and the disk system into one unit, didn't have a keyboard, so they had to use the trackball the entire time. It had a dummy character on it, which they ultimately loved so much that they decided to just make it the main character. Originally named Popopo, eventually they changed to Twinkle Popo, which God knows how much I wouldn't have liked playing Twinkle Popo and the Lost Planet, but, you know, could have easily been a thing. HAL Laboratory really began their relationship with Nintendo making this game, as under Nintendo supervision, the game received an extensive marketing campaign where they got Kirby eating a man, and also nearly got Kirby being turned yellow. Supposedly, Kirby's named after John Kirby, an American lawyer for Nintendo. They pulled Nintendo America for names, and I guess that's how they got it. Though personally, considering that comics were around during the time, they could have easily picked Kirby because of fucking Jack Kirby. So, yes, the game series has been going pretty steadily since 1992 with a lot of games and a lot of story. A lot of story that's hidden under the layers of this crazy, very simple game series.
Kirby, 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 that's a name you should know. Kirby, 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 he's the star of the show. He's more than you think, he's got maximum pink. Kirby, Kirby, Kirby's the one.
For the most part, the Kirby series, starting with Kirby's Dream Land in 1992, and the most recent one being, of course, in 2022, Kirby and the Forgotten Land, is majorly just about an apparently 8-inch tall? Sure. Pink puffball, of course, known as Kirby, often fighting against the giant maybe penguin, King Dedede, and of course sometimes fighting with a guy who may or may not be part of the same species at being Mennonite. And we'll kind of just go for these general worlds, a forest world, probably another forest world, some sort of ice world, some sort of sand world, some sort of fire world, probably something in space at some point, something mechanical in some capacity, and then something just like weird as it eventually leads into the big final boss, which you go, oh, that's creepy, and it happens every time. Kirby's Adventure really upped the amount of levels and the amount of things you could do, and specifically introduced copy abilities. Yeah, Dreamland didn't have copy abilities. You just ate people as Kirby and spat them out. And that was it. Ultimately beating up King Dedede again for the second time, you find out he's actually protecting the Star Rod and trying to stop Kirby from accidentally awakening Nightmare, this big evil wizard man. Ultimately then Kirby in a space shooter section will have to fight against. The exact same thing will happen for all of the Kirbys since. Released at the exact same time as Kirby's Pinball Land, a very bad pinball game, and Kirby's Dream Course, a pretty fun golf game? Because of course, where you play as that yellow Kirby, whose name may or may not be Kirby, and may or may not be even canon. Later on, 1995, we'll have Dreamland 2, basically the exact same story, now with the fact that King Dedede had actually been taken over by dark matter, this weird, creepy, one-eyed monster that ultimately is really only fought alongside its weird samurai form when you collect all of the things. That's sort of the thing of what the Dark Matter trilogy is. They're three of the exact same sort of game. They're very, very similar. Dreamland 2 and 3, one on the SNES and one on the Game Boy, very similar to the first Dreamland, have Kirby with the copy abilities that you know and love, but without the hats, really helped out by the little animal friends. Rick, Kine, Koo, the weird ones in 3 people don't care as much about, you know, those guys. They sort of have their own different qualities to them, their own different, this is what they're good for, this is what they're not good for. Personally, I like the animal friends in 2 more than 3, but people like 3 more than 2 in their own different ways, so it's really up to you. They're very, very fun in general. Of course, released alongside them are Block Ball and Star Stacker, later Super Star Stacker, because of course it was, which is just puzzle games. But more importantly, Kirby Superstar, which really brought in the whole hat thing with more than just your regular main storyline. It had a couple, like, smaller stories in the middle of it. Kirby fights a giant bird. Kirby beats the shit out of Mennonite, who's starting some kind of military coup in some capacity, weirdly enough. Kirby just replaying the first game, but in better graphics, because it's on the SNES instead of the Game Boy. For some reason. It eventually ended with you helping this weird jester creature find parts of this, like, wish-granting machine in space, which ultimately turns him into a demon. and then he gets murdered by Kirby. With Dreamland 3 introducing a stronger version of Dark Matter, the Dark Matter storyline continues in the Kirby 64, The Crystal Shards. Now, this game is very much just a 2D side-scroller game, just happens to be rendered in 3D, and that's kind of just what it is. It's just sort of Dreamland 2 and 3 again, but in 3D. Collect all of the mentioned crystal shards and eventually you get a crystal gun, and you're able to fight Zero, except Zero 2, but not that Zero 2, but this Zero 2, who looks like a creepy angel thing, and for some reason, poops out a cactus. At least around the same point of Tilt and Tumble, which is basically another dumb puzzle game, which is one of Nintendo's first attempt to make you move your whole entire console to play the game, which is a thing they'll never stop doing for some reason. Kirby 64 really began this change in the series that ultimately Superstar, which was the more popular one, began to show off the new aesthetic the series would kind of go going forward, especially because the original creator, Masahiro Sakurai, would just kind of stop being around. He wouldn't really be part of the games ever again. Supposedly he had something to do with Air Ride 3 whole years later, the game I played so much as a kid, a fantastic racing game that is also in 3D, and technically the only time you can play Kirby in full 3D motion until 2021. Released at around the same point of a remake of the very original game Kirby Nightmare in Dreamland, which really just kind of takes the anime Kirby and puts it on the cover, but really just makes it a better looking version of the original game. Remember City Trial, where you just ran around doing whatever you want, breaking shit and potentially getting the like Super 1 and pissing off your sister because you got the thing? You're like, haha, eat shit! I got that big giant motorcycle! Oh crap, we're fighting DDD, we're all gonna lose. Such a great game that you only played one mode of, because the only other mode was just kind of whatever, and then I don't even remember the third one. The hell was that? A year after Air Ride would be Kirby and the Amazing Mirror. Kirby and the Amazing Mirror was a Metroidvania game. If you don't know Metroidvania, named after both the Metroid and Castlevania games, are kind of just platformers where you go around an area where there's no real, like, levels. Everything's just sort of together. You sort of just go wherever which direction you want, eventually picking up shit, which allows you to go into other directions. A game type I'm not fully the most into, but not something I'd like shoo away, you know? Kirby and the Amazing Mirror, though, despite my lack of full knowledge of Metroidvanias, is not a fantastic Metroidvania, and personally, not my favorite Kirby game. Maybe next year, when we were sort of deciding to transition from Game Boy Advance to DS, we decided, hey, the DS has a stylus! Hello, little stylus!
Hello, Mario.
And of course, with the stylus, it means drawing on your screen, and who else could be the easy draw on your screen guy but Kirby? They picked the moving your console around thing on the DS for Yoshi.
Wow!
And both games suck. People have this love for Canvas Curse for reasons that I guess I can kind of see, but listen, there's a better touch-the-screen gimmick game that'll be made later. It's not Canvas Curse. So, sorry, not sorry. Squeak Squad will be made later, a game that is basically just your regular side-scrolling Kirby game that was made with very similar sprites to Kirby and the Amazing Mirror, that I'm pretty sure it was made in a bit of a rush. But it has some neat little references towards the anime aesthetically. It's just kind of an okay game. It's a game I played a whole bunch as a kid, so much to the point that my DS cartridge broke. So I had to literally like hold it into the thing for the game to even read it. It's the first game I ever really 100%ed though, so I'm kind of proud of that. The Kirby main series would go a bit on of a hiatus, but would indeed bring a much better version of the Superstar game with Superstar Ultra in the middle of that in 2008, and it is fantastic. They're replacing some stuff, they added some cool new stuff. The like original game but better, but even better. All of the modes, but now you're Meta Knight ripping shit and then fighting against this crazy pink man, but like a different one than the other crazy pink man, now we all know. It would be a game that would be clearly not meant to be a Kirby game, that someone in Nintendo went, make that a Kirby game, which is weird because it feels like they've done that before and might do that again in the future. Weird. Fucking a big wizard just comes from space and cuts Kirby into a bunch of pieces so we can kill him faster, but the guys from Squeak Squad, oh boy, a good reason Squeak Squad's better than Amazing Mirror, got him. Actually save him, and then allow him to have a way to, like, get all the Kirbys to just throw themselves at things, and eventually it works. Of course, throughout this time, there were hints at a fully 3D Kirby game. People were like, well, imagine city mode from the racing one, but now it's the not racing one, and it's just like, no, that game didn't come out. That game never came out. That game, we only saw a little bit of, and in fact, they did show us clearly some gameplay from a game that looked more like a better looking version of a game that was like Kirby 64. You could even like have your guys stacked on each other. You could get Kirby to eat enemies and make them into allies. Concepts that would be used later on, and it's weird that this was never made in the way that it was shown, but it, in some capacity, eventually came together and became Kirby Return to Dreamland. And it is a fantastic game. I absolutely love Return to Dreamland, the second ever game I ever really 100%ed. I love Kirby so much. Return to Dreamland really is a real like return to form, because after Amazing Mirror being a very different kind of game, they're just being remakes and spin-offs recently, and people not being super into Squeak Squad, this was a real like return to what people really liked about Kirby. It is a really great time with just Kirby, King Dedede, Meta Knight, and one of the Waddle Dees, which is now wearing a bandana for some reason and has a spear. Because, okay, you can either get those three or three other Kirbys, which presumably came from when an evil Meta Knight just also cut Kirby into multiple pieces, because people like to do that for some reason. And for the second time in his life, he got tricked by an evil, weird jester creature to give him evil god powers. This time there's some story in there, with him explaining there's some kind of weird ancient people that made his weird ship, and he has to fight this dragon to get some kind of treasure, which ends up controlling some sort of dark force that may be related to the Eye from before? Weird. But this was around the same time where there would be, you know, the big anniversary for Kirby, so they would re-release the original games on the Wii alongside it. And in fact, Magloire would show up again to sort of be like, sup, sorry about what I just did there. I'm alive again, by the way. Let's race. And you could literally do that as like a second minigame. Plus you could watch some episodes of the anime. Isn't that so cool? That's just funny. That's just weird. Since then, besides literally 2021, there has been a multitude of games since. There has been Triple Deluxe, Planet Robobot, and Star Allies, of which have clearly the exact same engine, or at least game ideas that were being presented in Return to Dreamland. They got the same ideas, but two of them don't have multiplayer in the same capacity, but do have very similar control sets, but add their own weird gimmicks. When Return to Dreamland had giant versions of some of the power-ups, Triple Deluxe had Kirby suck more, and you could suck bigger things, and eventually killed a giant evil bug lady with suck. And eventually you fought an evil corporation with mechs in Planet Robobot as they attempted to make everyone robots. Crazy. It's a crazy game. But of course there were multiple like differing modes. There's always been a harder mode, and there's always been like an arena mode where you can fight all the bosses all together, alongside the different, you know, little extra stuff where maybe you have Kirby throw a thing at a time, or again, shoot a man. But these ones really started more focusing on them alongside an arena. After you beat the hard mode, you got the true arena where you fought certain weird guys like the Pink Man from before, who later became a butterfly for some reason. But there was also like a crazy fighting Kirby thing, a like Rhythm King Dedede thing, alternate modes like the Meta Knight thing where he goes through the games, and there's one where you have that with Dedede, which is cool. A couple of these alongside like a Battle Royale game and whatever the hell Blowout Blast is were like released as separate smaller games as like sort of like apps on the 3DS online store, which is going out soon, by the way. So if you ever want to play these games, you better have already downloaded them, because if you're watching this in a couple of years, you can't play them anymore. You probably can. I'm pretty sure there's ROMs of them online somewhere. Yar. Importantly, Star Allies eventually came at the end of it, where Kirby could, of course, make enemies into allies, which also included special allies, which were multiple characters throughout the series. It got the Meta Knight and Waddle Dee again, two of them now, technically, but you also got the crazy guys who have tricked Kirby before. The guy who cut him in half that one time, not that other time, but that one time with the mirror. The guy who lost his queen because Kirby sucked her to death, who's now looking for a new girlfriend. the animal friends, and even Gooey, the best animal friend, who I didn't mention before, because I love him that dearly. But also some of the cult members who nearly trying to kill Kirby and all of his friends, which weirdly, like a good majority of Kirby's friends are people who have tried to kill him in the past, and he just went, oh, you're good now? Fine with me. A cool, weird, like, sort of RPG-y Kirby, a Kirby Clash, would be brought in. It is full of microtransactions, but they made a better version of it, thankfully. And then the fighting game got an even better version of it with Kirby Fighters 2. 2 were probably the best of these weird spin-offs. Like, the rest of them, whatever. But these two, actually kind of worth your time. Like, not gonna lie here. They also add in these weird ideas of where the hell do they take place? The Dream Kingdom? What the hell is that? And they even have, like a couple of their own things. Like, when's Wrestler Kirby gonna show up in, like, a main game? I was hoping that was gonna show up in Forgotten Land, which, of course, is the most recent game. The first time you really have been able to play Kirby in full 3D that isn't on, like, a 3DS weird minigame, or on part of a game about racing. Though that being said, besides in main 3D, it's just kind of your regular Kirby game, but you are able to upgrade your powers in Kirby in the Forgotten Land, and you kind of get help looking through secrets with help of your weird guy. It's just kind of like a regular Kirby game. You jump around, you suck people, and you barf them up like a weird, disgusting creature, that of which Kirby is. The only thing really different about Kirby in the Forgotten Land is there's no space shooter section, because every single game, except like the spin-offs, had a space shooter section in it, and this one didn't. You can't, however, be a truck, so that kind of makes up for it. I would love something new from Kirby personally, but what I certainly don't want to see different out of Kirby is the thing you came here for. Let's talk about Kirby lore. So Kirby lore really wasn't anything for the first couple of games. All you really got was Kirby's gonna fight against this big king, which ends up being a penguin man, and he then is able to get all the food back. P.S. He turns into a giant balloon, something he never does ever again. And of course, Adventure / Nightmare in Dreamland would of course introduce us to just the fact that there is a weird dream fountain, and that there is a evil wizard in it, but that's sort of the only thing we really need to have. There is now an extra villain part of it, and that's sort of the case in the later Dark Matter trilogy. There's this weird evil force that exists, and Kirby needs to fight it. That's all it really needs to be, you know? It's something like in the background of, here's this creepy thing that keeps coming back, you know? First it showed up in Dreamland, now it's back in Dreamland, now it's fighting other planets, and they need our help, the people who have sort of fought it before. That's sort of what's going on there. But as we sort of went on, it became a little bit more complicated. There was some more dialogue, there was some more world building, but it was still kind of just like, Kirby and Meta Knight go into an evil mirror in the Mirror World, which is really actually a small island, like one of the many that exist in Dreamland that's just hanging around there, and they just happen to go in a mirror that's in there that came from somewhere. And then also maybe the evil one-eyed force from before happened to come back and was shoved into a chest that accidentally got involved into a story involving Kirby chasing after some mice that took his cake. Sure. The most story that Kirby really had for a while was Superstar Ultra, with a lot more actual dialogue, but really just at the end there, Milky Way Wishes was really just like the most we got. There was a bunch of dialogue involving how scared Meta Knight's friends are about how Kirby's wrecking their ship, but that's all you really got for the most of the game. It was just kind of just Kirby going through stuff, Kirby going down into the mines, and then finally a weird jester man tells him to go into the planets nearby, where we find out there's a couple planets nearby, like Dreamland. It's not the only time, as later Star Allies also shows these planets. I personally would like to imagine that the planets we see Superstar Ultra are the same ones we see later in Star Allies. There's a couple ones that aren't like connected, but it's whatever. Later on, there's little bits of story in Canvas Curse and in Rainbow Curse where they do explain like that the villain really could have just got into some weird paint demon stuff. And weirdly, there's some background stuff in a later game that explains how those two are actually connected, and also connected to an enemy in that one. So they're like sisters, which is pretty cool. But like the most dialogue we would get would really be from Epic Yarn and Mass Attack, which would really just kind of be in between stuff of like, here's why we're going to this level, and here's this villain, and why he's sort of interrupting our adventure, and why he wants to kill Kirby specifically. And it's just kind of both times an evil wizard. Just one has yarn powers and the other one is strange. Though weirdly, there is a vague mention that maybe goes to Mass Attack in later Triple Deluxe. In these recent games, there's been a little bit more dialogue, a little bit more story. As I mentioned, Return to Dreamland seemingly has Magolor talk about these ancients that created this ship that could fly through dimensions, and that they're seemingly the remnants of their society is where you land at the end of the game there. And that's very interesting to me. Seemingly relates to this like dead Earth-like planet that we saw in Kirby 64. There wasn't much story in that, but this like background that there's like dead societies out there, that maybe these are related, and they could easily be related to the whatever the hell made the big wish granting machine, which is confirmed in Planet Robobot later on. How these guys had found it and how it came from an ancient like lost society, and that their weird wish granting machine is the exact same kind as the one from Superstar and Superstar Ultra, which is so weird that a bunch of these strange machines have come from this lost ancient society that's like the forerunners from Halo. Triple Deluxe isn't related in this, but it does seemingly explain connections to other games. Someone who hated the light actively affected the people of the sky, including the weird bug guys that live in some of the many floating islands that we had seen in previous Kirby games, and this pushed one of them, the Queen of the Bug People, to be affected by the mirror, because that thing was still around after that game, so she slowly got corrupted by it, and eventually became a big bee lady and began trying to take over the whole place. And Kirby can like unlock different parts of himself, and that there's more to him throughout these games. Plus, there's different versions of these bosses that imply that there's more to their nature, that maybe they didn't really die afterward, that there's more things happening during this whole thing. I would like to imagine that Meta Nightmare Returns is during Planet Robobot, where he fights the like dead, still being controlled zombie body of the original main villain there, as he fights against the like one part of the wish granting machine as Kirby's shooting at it in space, enough to like fight clones of previous villains. I'd like to imagine a lot of these like stronger EX forms are like actively canon, that they were the things that were very soon afterwards. Like the idea that Sectonia did like fight all the way to becoming zombified at the end there, that Magolor basically like nearly succumbed to the darkness and nearly became this inhuman creature, where a little bit of his humanity even was still around at the end of it. The big creepy god that the weird crazy cult guys that are in Star Allies summoned is actively this thing that is the source of all evil in the galaxy, and in fact will be reborn into something new after Kirby basically beats the shit out of its original form, and then gets into its core, and then beats it to like its this like origin soul form, and due to its like weird Kirby face, seemingly implies some kind of relation between the two, potentially that it may have actually reincarnated in some capacity in the past. And due to the fact that it was mentioned to be sealed up in some capacity, and there's some weird eyeball force connected into the crown also made by the same ancients that sealed away this weird crazy creature, may have actually had been split apart, and maybe those parts reincarnated in a separate part of the universe as potentially Kirby and Dark Matter. And I feel like that's what a lot of people sort of assume, is that this actively regenerated into one or the other. And considering the weird dark force that is again connected to the crown that was being protected by a giant dragon, I feel like this is what happened. The thing is, all this is incredibly just speculation, and the only thing we really know is that these ancients did in fact eventually come to Dreamland, as they were later mentioned in Forgotten Land to come from wherever they did, came to what Forgotten Land was before, made a whole society, and then left after a thing they found that basically fucked them up enough for them to just try and seal it away, the same way they had done before. So this, though considering they've basically gotten rid of all magic, as shown by them pushing away the weird cult guys that we met in Star Allies. They only really had the sign, so they could just put it into a big capsule, and only a small part of it would sort of escape and become the weird little friend you see in the Forgotten Land. Until later, it would absorb a part of the butterfly that I mentioned before, and literally become this big chaos-powered demon, almost like maybe a new version of Void, but not like a reincarnation of Void, but like made in such a way that maybe how Void was made originally. The like perfect cosmic events that eventually created such this evil god that was as strong as Void, that only someone that is potentially related to Void and itself were able to team up and defeat it, eventually allowing it to find peace as the very last parts of it would eventually meet our little friend at the end of the EX arena of Forgotten Land. Here's the thing though, none of this really makes sense, does it? Especially with Team Kirby Clash. Team Kirby Clash shows in this dream kingdom where there's a bunch of Kirbys. There's also a Meta Knight, and there's also a Megalore, and there's also a Taranza, and an Evil Mirror, and a Nightmare. And it's just like, when is this? I had originally thought that maybe this was during the time of the Ancients, as maybe these in fact are the Ancients. Maybe Kirby comes from the Ancients. But then that sort of gets rid of the idea that maybe he's actually a reincarnation of the weird evil final boss from Star Allies. So I guess it could just be dark matter. I mean, he does have a big eyeball form, but then what's with the Kirby face? Is he going to become a new Kirby? They already have a Kirby, so who cares? It's cool to think that Kirby is related in some capacity to this evil thing, but what about the fact that there just is other Kirbys in some capacity? Are they related in some way? And what is Meta Knight? Every time you beat him, he ends up looking like Kirby, so what's with that? But then I thought to myself, what if the Ancients made these creatures? What if in some capacity they made these guys to be these servants for them, these things that would do different jobs for them? And in fact, I feel like this makes a lot of sense. As in fact, I feel like it makes sense that the Ancients actually, now that we know they went across the world in many different directions after they seemingly end of their society thanks to Void Termina, it's clear they more likely went to other parts of the galaxy, and I'd like to imagine that due to similar creatures that are on Dreamland in 64 appearing in these other planets, that they brought some of these guys to these other planets. So they definitely had some ones that they didn't bring with them, as there are some different looking creatures, probably prototypes of stuff like the Waddle Dees in the main homeworld in the Return to Dreamland game. I'd like to imagine all the enemies you see in Kirby Clash are all the ones made by the Ancients. There's a whole bunch of them, but strangely not every single weird creature that shows up in Kirby shows up there. A bunch of stuff could easily still be specific to Dreamland, and that's the reason you don't see them in Kirby 64. You know, you don't see the mouse guys of Squeak Squad there. You don't see any other deity in anything else, which is weird. So clearly he is like native to Dreamland. The Cappies are definitely native to Dreamland, especially when you consider the anime it's in the canon. And this is how other things are explained, and this is where it all hit it for me. Before I even watched the Kirby anime for this video, I already had the idea for a while that I think that these guys were created by the Ancients. They are servants and warriors and weird experiments that they have the warriors fight for various reasons that the Ancients had made with whatever technology or whatever breeding stuff that they had made during their time, and eventually kind of brought with them in the very small ways they even were able to, until eventually dying out and leaving whatever weird technology around, specifically the like weird computer that's left underground in the weird ancient temple you see in Superstar Ultra. Yeah, that's clearly like some sort of ancient technology that they just had left when eventually they died off, and kind of just left the creatures to mingle on with the weird shapes. I feel like a lot of the ones are just kind of shapes, like the, you know, like the electric one, the one that's the most annoying enemy, that one. What really made it all make sense for me, especially on how Nightmare is involved, is the anime. Eventually going into this whole history of that there was this group of great warriors, the Star Warriors, that fought against Nightmare, and specifically, they're not exactly said, but is very much implied that Meta Knight came from Nightmare. And I'd like to imagine that Nightmare, being that Nightmare was attacking one of the Ancients' planets, as in Super Kirby Clash, Nightmare, or specifically one related to the one that you fight in Kirby Clash, with this Nightmare Empire that they had, then went and tried and take over the remnants of the galaxy, at least that area, that the Ancients no longer had any control of. As not all of them are made by the Ancients, they're clearly their own species. It's trying to fight for their own planets, as we see a multitude of planets being fought for by the Star Warriors. Which, by the way, people think that the Star Warriors are specifically Mennonite and Kirby. No. In the anime, it says they are a group of people. Knuckle Joe's dad was a Star Warrior. This weird lady who looks like she was from a 90s comics mom is a Star Warrior. A couple of them look like they belong in the same species. A couple of them don't. A bunch of them don't, because they're not all the same species. They are a group of people, and specifically, Mennonite had come from Nightmare, which I think that Nightmare, in fact, took over the remnants of ancient technology, specifically because if we are going to go with the fact that every monster from Kirby Clash is made by the Ancients, this includes the ones that are also monsters sent by Nightmare Enterprises in the actual anime. And that I'm using as full proof that they are using ancient technology to make their own monsters, either remake ones that have already been made, or make their own versions of them. And that is my reasoning behind why Mennonite looks like Kirby, but also isn't anything like Kirby, because he's meant to be a darker version of him. But clearly, their things aren't perfect. Not only do they make monsters in the same way, just through some weird factory thing, but they also have to, like, inject people or something with whatever they do to literally turn them into monsters from just regular people. Whatever you want to consider people in the Kirby universe, you know. P.S. Here's a bunch of weird things that I found out that are canon to Kirby now when we consider the anime as canon, which I entirely do. The main female character, Tiff, is 13 because of the amount of rings that are shown. Her dad is mentioned to have bought a ring every year after their marriage, and there is specifically 12 in there, and if she was born exactly the year after, then she would be 13 because he had just bought a now 13th ring, and we don't see the very first one, thus having her be 13 specifically shown by these rings in a throwaway gag that Escargoon happened to find all but one, the original one. And then is more than likely 16 in the 3DS special because she can fucking drive in that one. The anime happens over the process of 2 years because the 50th episode out of 100, by the way, is mentioned to be a year since Kirby got there. So that means 50 episodes later would naturally be a second year. The 3DS special having this character drive, if we assume that it's the same sort of thing as in Earth, which no reason to think why it would be the case, but there is at the very least in the multiple racing episodes that are in Kirby a clear like age that needs to happen from there to be a go-kart to a real car. So there needs to be like an actual like driving age. So presumably the anime actually happens with a process of 3 years before they eventually fight Nightmare at the end of it. Anyway, other weird stuff. A DD meal is 7 cheeseburgers, which I'm pretty sure is mainly a dub thing. Kawasaki trained under a weird guy named Shiitake with a guy who looks like a cat. The 2 weird floating guys, of which are based after bosses, of which they call Fololo and Falala, even though it's not their names, they come from a monster that looks like the young kid from the Eggerland games, a series of games that those bosses are actually inspired aesthetically by, which probably means that those games are also canon, and they happened in like a slightly farther away part of Dreamland somewhere, and that their son was just found by Nightmare and used and then sliced in half to become 2 separate entities. Which is so weird. There is a group of ninjas that were like an intergalactic like force of mercenaries that only died out because one betrayed them alongside the Star Warriors, and now there's just one there who like swore revenge after he was beaten by Kirby and never really appeared in the anime after that. Considering there are definitely multiple wheelies and that a very angry Cappy gets turned into one, this implies that wheelies come from a subspecies of Cappies that decided to turn themselves into wheels through a process that was more likely what came about Escargoon's like monster creator, which he uses a couple episodes to turn regular things into monsters, which is apparently entirely possible just naturally because there's a sheep inspired by you know, that movie that becomes like a big angry sheep. And weirdly, in Tourist Trap, there is more Cappy that come from a faraway land. And in Princess in Distress, we see that it's not just specifically the like main Cappies that have more like human-like faces. It's specifically the ruling class of Cappies, and more likely due to the fact that the tourists from one and that this princess are both purple. This means that there are two species of Cappies, but they're probably even, but only in the way that there is specifically like a ruling class of more like human-like Cappies that are ruling of the like mushroom-like Cappies. And considering they specifically come to DDD's place, this means I believe that Tiff Tuff and their parents are there specifically to be this like envoy to like have him make peace with the like main Cappy area. But more importantly, throughout the entirety of the anime, though they seemingly have respect for King DDD, they are constantly at ends with him, understandably so, considering he constantly tries to just fuck shit up constantly. I mean, there are 3 whole episodes where he makes an evil school that gets blown up and is rebuilt, and the next time it shows up, and every time there's an evil teacher, and they fall for it twice after it already had happened. How do you not learn? What? So it's clear that the, like, lower class Cappies are not as smart, which is weird when you think about it, but they're at least smart enough to understand that King Dedede is not a great leader, and they are constantly on the cusp of, like, a revolution or, like, a revolt. So it's very clear that shortly after the anime, probably 2 years, considering the age that Tiff is at the end of it, or whatever, that she more than likely takes the Cappies and fucks off, which is probably actually the reason why the first game begins the way it does. And this is the reason I firmly think the anime has to be canon. Otherwise, you don't have as cool like an arc. King Dedede goes through this arc that if you take his personality from the anime where he's constantly greedy and lazy and always wants to hit things, he's a big child that clearly is not a great ruler, and a lot of his ruling class knows that, except for the Waddle Dees that are fiercely loyal regardless of what he does, which is crazy. But thing is, there are, like, good sides to DDD. There are a couple episodes where King DDD actually is nice to Kirby. There's an episode where the world is seemingly about to end because of a meteor about to crash into it, and he spends his last moments trying to be friends with Kirby. This episode, alongside this episode where they literally pretend that Kirby dies, shows off that King DDD doesn't actually want to kill Kirby. Throughout the 100 episodes of him attempting to try and kill Kirby, he just wants to hurt him real bad. Like, him or Escargoon, who also has good moments with Kirby where he attempts to make friends with him, are actually good guys, and they just are very mischievous and want to just prove that they're better because they have very clear egos on them and like to just pull pranks on people. However, in the anime, in the several background stuff, it's clear that this evil empire wasn't always like Nightmare Enterprise. It was a vast, great empire, and now it's been reduced thanks to the big war against the Star Wars, as they were much more numerous by the end of it. And Meta Knight, with the 2 ragtag friends he finds, Blade and Sword guys, he just kind of goes to Dreamland, meets some of the remnants of the ancients there, and sort of just settles down where King Dedede is. Of course, this brings us into that weird pink guy I mentioned. Again, not Kirby, but in fact Galactonite, the guy who Meta Knight keeps wanting to fight. And why does he keep wanting to fight him? Well, because he was truly inspired by it. Why else turn against your weird creators when, because you're inspired by this guy who was part of the same group that your creators had stolen the technology from. At some point, he was very clearly inspired by the tales of the Aeon Hero, which we can see by descriptions was sealed away by the ancients due to them fearing his power, and he was inspired by him to be like him. That's the reason why they look like and why he wants to continuously potentially fight him. But the weirdest part about Galactonite is the fact that he becomes Morphonite in Star Allies, a thing that is in fact canon because the after story of Forgotten Land brings him in. Yeah, you know that butterfly that constantly floats on Kirby's face? That is literally one half of an even greater warrior, split in half. They clearly had to be something at some point, otherwise why would they be able to just touch and merge together into this even crazier, scary, strong warrior? And that's my further proof of something else. That thing I just mentioned of I think that the Jamba Heart is not the only thing sealing Void Termina was because of a thing introduced in the exact same game. Why else would Morphonite be even able to exist if he wasn't split in half by some sort of weird technology that sealed him up in the first place? It's clear that from him being sealed up in a jewel and the other part just kind of being sent elsewhere, that's clearly possible in other ways. And Void Termina, though in a much different way, in a much more fragile way, because they clearly don't know how to fight an Elder God, was more likely split in half for him to even be able to be shoved into the Jamba Heart, with the other part being given to a dragon. So why else give it to him if it wasn't going to be something very important? And what else would be important than the literal Elder God that nearly destroyed your entire species, sending them across the stars, which we canonically know they did, thus allowing the little parts that aren't being guarded by this giant dragon to just be taken away by an evil wizard who wants revenge on his mom or whatever being killed, however that nightmare is related to that nightmare. Go ahead, make your own theory for that, but to eventually try and take over the galaxy and then utilize as some way to just like sell monsters to people. See, it all makes sense in my head. It all makes sense. And if you kind of pull it all together, thanks to using context from the like background stories mentioned in the anime, through the like repeated showings of Meta Knight's background and how he's related to Kirby, it's clear that Kirby's were plentiful before, but there isn't anyone now. But the real question is, how is Kirby a reincarnation of Void Termina? If he's just one of many Kirbys, how is he special? Well, why is he more recent? See, in the anime, he is more recent. He's just floating out in space. That's the thing, though. It's clear that he had recently been made. He is a baby in the anime. And my idea is that ultimately, while it took a long time for the energies left off to sort of all come together and be brought together, the energies from both of the canisters that are keeping it inside sort of seeped out slowly. I mean, they clearly influence the people that are using them, so they clearly do definitely have energies from them. I think they slowly seeped out and sort of birthed new creatures. I think the one that is the crown that is more closer to the technologies of the ancients is the one that later sort of brought itself together and sort of just found its way into the technology, started up, poofed Kirby out of whatever machine makes Kirbys, of which I was assuming it's a machine that like photo prints Kirbys. Don't ask me what, that's my image that I came up with, but I think that's what happened. It is the only way to start up that machine again, and it made a new Kirby with the energies of the thing. That is the only reason why this Kirby is able to have such weird, strange powers, even more so than the Kirbys from before. And since, as though there are other Kirbys later in because of Amazing Mirror, those ones never have been shown to do the crazy stuff that Kirby can do. That after interacting with the weird void that Void Termina does come from, he can make his powers even stronger. So bringing this all to a conclusion, the real lore of Kirby is a long time ago there were these more than likely humans that lived on Halcandria, lived in this glorious, technologically advanced planet, and made these weird, strange creatures for their own various reasons, whether it be for cattle or just for experiments that they just kind of let off into the world, and eventually their own warriors, possibly to guard their planet. Some were biological and some were technological, and ultimately they thrived until eventually they found weird magic from an alternate universe that got too out of hand when an evil cult started using it to attempt to bring back some sort of ancient god. When that Void Termina was brought out, they were barely able to defeat it with help of the Aeon Hero. And after splitting it into two, putting one part into a crown for their dragon protector, and the other part in the Jamba Heart to be thrown far off into the galaxy, the powers from Void would sort of seep across the land. The land's now nearly destroyed. They spread across the land after sealing the Aeon Hero himself into 2 separate parts. One as the Galactonite sealed in a crystal that would be only brought about through some strange special event that is still kind of unclear, and one a butterfly that will float throughout the galaxy until it eventually finds its second half, or at least something that could maybe be as strong as its second half, which as it eventually lands on Dreamland, it thought will be Kirby, but that's regardless. Though it will eventually find itself, the other Halcandrians will sort of find different parts of the galaxy to find homes on, the most important being the main setting of Crystal Shards, and I firmly believe that the ancients, the Halcandrians, whatever you call them, are the people that we see on that planet, the last remaining of that species, as the rest were destroyed by dark matter. Why else would that planet be specifically targeted if it weren't for it being the last bastion of that race of people? Dark matter would try and find every light in the galaxy and try and snuff it out, and it would, including on planets like our very own. As it would be doing that, the little empire that would be growing in the pocket of power left by the fall of the Halcandrian people, the Nightmare Empire would try and take over that section of the galaxy, but would be stopped by the group of people led by one of its own creations, the Star Warriors. The war will be so destructive that it will take out the 2 races of people, and the Nightmare Empire would become Nightmare Enterprises, as it would attempt to sort of reuse the Halcandrian technology, at first recreating stuff like the Galbos, and eventually making their own weird monsters, and eventually would find themselves to Dreamland, a place where the Halcandrians had set up before and had died out, with only a little bit of them still being around, one of which I believe to firmly be Adeline. Although that planet would live on its own, thrive with the last remnants of the ancients' own creatures, as they would sort of make peace with the own, just like, native people of the planet, that being the Cappies and the weird penguins that exist there, who are sort of going on their own thing. Eventually, the seeping of the crown would find its way to one of the Halcandrian technologies, and Kirby would result in it, eventually finding himself on Dreamland, where of course one of the last remnants of the Star Warriors had himself settled, Meta Knight. Meta Knight would of course train him, eventually defeating several of the Nightmare Enterprise's own monsters, eventually resulting in a big battle against them at the end of the anime, which would end in Nightmare being sealed away in the Star Rod. The Star Rod being placed onto the Fountain of Dreams would be kept there until ultimately after the Cappies would revolt and go to their homeland, thanks to more than likely Tiff. Deity would kind of start wanting to sort of go on his own arc and would begin to grow as a person, though it would be after Kirby would ultimately have to knock some sense into him. Dedede would of course try and protect the Star Rod, though Kirby would inadvertently reawaken this nightmare creature and would finally defeat it, as was his destiny to do so in the first place. But eventually the evil dark matter would find its way to Dreamland, and though with Kirby's own friendship they were able to convince one of them to become their friend in Gooey, they were able to majorly fight off dark matter and his influence twice, as it would come back immediately afterwards, and would then find the need to help the other last bastion of the Halcandrians, as they would then go off and defeat the final core of dark matter, seemingly for good. Though a little bit of it would stay and remain, it would find its way into a creation of the Nightmare Empire itself, the little magic mirror, eventually merging into the monster inside it to, of course, create King Darkmind, which, as we know, will eventually begin causing a little bit of trouble a little while later. In the process, though, Dedede would seemingly show himself to not be a good enough leader, as he was taken over a multitude of times, and though Kirby would stop him, Meta Knight would attempt to do a military coup against him. Though because of Kirby stopping him, Meta Knight would, of course, make a deal with King Dedede, is that they would, of course, go off and try to find the last remaining bits of dark matter, which I believe is where King Dedede was during the events of A Kirby and the Amazing Mirror, as he literally isn't in that game for whatever reason. In the process of them going to find it, Kirby would have to deal with his own thing, helping a strange jester man find some of the last remaining technology of the ancients, which would lead into him becoming a crazy demon man. And though Kirby would defeat it with his weird crazy Kirby powers, the monster would slowly reconstitute back into existence a few bit of years later. Eventually, Meta Knight would go into the mirror, and though he would find some trouble, Kirby would help him defeat the last remaining dark matter, and they would seal it inside the chest, which Dedede would attempt to guard. So eventually, some mischievous mice who were stealing stuff in that area eventually make their way to it, and Kirby eventually has to defeat it for the very last time, the last little bit of dark matter in Kirby Squeak Squad. Throughout that process, Kirby would defeat many other people, finding different versions of dark powers of their own degree, mainly a couple artists and a couple other weird wizard guys, but the most important of them would come from far off in space, who was probably not related to Nightmare in any way, and his actions, though seemingly were just mainly to fight Kirby, would actually deal a big blow to the people of the floating islands around Dreamland, which would eventually cause one of them to re-find the evil mirror and eventually be corrupted by it, this resulting in Queen Sectonia. After Kirby and his friends would once again be tricked into helping another person find another bit of the Halcandrian technologies, and then later it's magic, with him being another giant crazy demon man who would later reconstitute into a better, less evil form a little while later. Kirby and friends would have to deal with the evil Queen Sectonia as she would attempt to take over the land herself, though eventually she would be fought to a near zombified form. She would be defeated. Soon enough, a evil corporation would find out about all the things that are happening here and decide that this is the right place to go for the leftover ancient technology that they would try and find to make their not only their business better, but especially their main president guy who has went so crazy he doesn't realize his daughter is still alive, so he wants to try and use the wish machine to try and wish her back. Ultimately, Kirby would stop him with his own technology and would blow up the crazy wish machine, though in the process Meta Knight would help destroy its still kind of living, now corrupted core, as it would start trying to clone some of the strongest creatures that have existed on said planet, which is nearly Galactic Knight himself, which Meta Knight would of course go and kill on his own, which would eventually be the reason why he would try and find the wish machine that Marx had found before and try and wish Galactic Knight back, which ultimately, after a big battle, Galactic Knight would be sealed once more, but would sort of float around the world and would eventually be disturbed once again when the Halcandrian evil Jambastian cult had found the Jamba Heart and decided to bring it to Dreamland to hopefully unlock it and bring out the chaos of Void Termina once again. After Kirby and all of his crazy friends, including the reconstituted evil villains from before, the weird thieves, the seemingly evil Meta Knight from the Dark Mirror, and most importantly, Gooey and the Animal Pals, and strange enough, the new president of the corporation, who's probably being simped over by the evil Bug Queen from before's old simp. So everyone's all together, they all unite, possibly off screen with the help of the Cappies as well, probably some of the Star Warriors, I'd like to imagine. Everyone comes together to help fight against the corruption of the Jamba Heart and helps Kirby as he defeats his evil original other side, and eventually the universe is finally cured of it all, with the most important part of that being they open a portal to the other dimension, and some of our heroes go and try to help the last members of the Jambastians, who in truth were really just being corrupted by their leader in the first place and never really wanted to be part of this at all. And in that process, they would eventually meet the Galactic Knight, and it would finally reunite with its other half, creating Morpho Knight. Though it would be fought off, it would find itself all the way far off in the galaxy, and would eventually find a small lost area that the Halcandrians were before they had even come to Dreamland in the first place, the Forgotten World. And those forgotten creatures begin to attempt to use the reason why they had left in the first place to bring Kirby there and get their own revenge. But eventually they would find out this would be pointless and would make peace with Kirby himself, as they would beat them up, and also their weird creature, who of course is also part of little friend Kirby makes there, who reunites, creating himself back into one creature at the end of there, but instead of being a crazy, evil, warlike creature like it was originally, it is now a peaceful friend of Kirby, because as we all know, Kirby makes friends with every single weird thing that he meets. But more or less, that is the story of Kirby. I'd like to imagine basically everything in the series is canon in some capacity. Not necessarily the exact way we see it, certainly not the fact that you, like, totally kill a boss and it poofs out of existence and it comes back later. That probably happens to everyone, which is the reason I think, like, every boss is, like, the same exact character every time. Like, you totally beat up the same bonkers in every game. It's the same guy, like that sort of thing. But regardless of gameplay to story disparity, I think that is the really fun part of Kirby, is that it does have this weird story behind it. It's fun, goofy nonsense, and that is the fun part of Kirby alongside that fun, goofy nonsense. You have the great platforming, and then you have this weird, deeper stuff that's fun to sort of pick into and sort of make your own theories. Of course, I made this because I have my own theories about it, and I wasn't really all into people's ideas of what the storyline was, so I decided to just make my own. If you have your own prevailing theories of Kirby, then leave that stuff in the comments. I'd love to definitely hear about it. But if you'd like my rambling and you want some other longer form stuff like I'm doing more recently, then you can go ahead and subscribe and check all that out that I have already made in the past and what I'll make in the future. But most importantly, stay good, stay safe, and don't be an asshole.